So what makes a good poem? I think for me, a poem that is accessible, that you can get inside of, that from the first line you feel an emotional attachment to it, but also aside from having that connection to it, you understand it. And I think it should be something that someone very young and someone very old can each come to and have an experience with. I think the same rules apply in terms of it needs to be a poem that they understand, that they have some kind of emotional connection to, and that they delight in, especially if they're very young. I want them to find some joy in the poem. So it's interesting because as a young person, I didn't know poetry the way I know it now. I didn't have the same kind of access to it. I didn't have the same kind of mirrors, whereas I could look at a poem and see some part of myself in it. I remember discovering Langston Hughes and his poem, I Love My Friend, He Went Away From Me. There's nothing more to say. The poem ends just as it began. I love my friend. And I was like, this makes sense. Is this poetry? And it really unlocked something. And then I discovered Nikki Giovanni and so many Eloise Greenfield and all of these African-American poets who really just unlocked it for me. And so once I understood that it was there and that it was relevant, it became really important to even the fact of me deciding to become a writer, a novelist first, but it was because of poetry that I went on to write novels and then eventually poetry. I write poetry because I love poetry and I feel like it's another way of speaking, especially through the written form. I mean, we have narrative, we have fiction, we have nonfiction. And we have poetry, and for me, poetry, I like how concise it can be. So when I'm writing picture books, that's poetry. So I look at the line break, I look at the entrance into the first line, the entrance into the narrative, the cadence, all of that I'm paying attention to because I think it's important. I get ideas from everywhere. I mean, you wake up in the morning and there are 10 things to write about between the time you brush your teeth and walk out of your house. So from news articles I read, from books I read, from conversations I have, from people I meet, from things I'm thinking about, for things in the world that I want to change, all over the place. None of it is easy. I don't think poetry is easy. I don't think prose is easy, but both are rewarding. And I write them at different points in my life. So I'm usually working on both. I'm usually working on a novel and a collection of poems or a poem. And the poem sometimes is easier to go back to and reconstruct or revise. The narrative, because it's so much bigger, takes a lot more concentration to get into, but on a good day, they both feel easy, but on most days, they both feel pretty hard. I don't know if it does. I don't know if poetry impacts young readers differently than prose. I think it depends on the reader and what they need in the moment. So some young people need a good poem, and maybe that's all they can absorb. Some people need a whole novel and to go into the world of that novel and be a part of it for a longer period of time. And some people can read a poem and be in that world for a long time after reading it, so it might resonate differently. But I think it really depends on the reader and the body of work they're working with. Poetry is getting more and more recognized by schools, by publishing houses, by young people in general. I mean, the book that I chose, The Crossover by Kwame Alexander, won the Newbery, which is the highest award you can win in literature for young people in the US. And then you look at something like me being Young People's Poet Laureate and people paying attention to that, and a lot more books being written in verse, everything from, I remember Karen Hess's book, Out of the Dust, and to Kwame and Brown Girl Dreaming, and people really starting to pay attention to it, and by extension, looking at the works of other poets. Like when I was a kid, maybe we got Robert Frost, and maybe we got some Maya Angelou, but for the most part, poetry was just one small part of a huge education, and now it's becoming more part of our everyday. And also, I think hip hop really changed it, right? The fact that people were doing spoken word and paying attention to rappers like Tupac and Biggie, and these people who were speaking rhymes, and then the recognition that lyrics were lyrics, whether they were in a hip hop song or on the page, whether they had music behind them or were simply written. And that really kind of changed the dialogue about poetry. So when I first started writing Brown Girl Dreaming, it was to try to figure out how I became a writer, how I got to this point of writing 30 books and winning awards and telling all of these stories. And then as I was writing, my mom died suddenly in the middle of writing it, and I realized it was an investigation into her life, and how, because of her, I got here, and because of the Great Migration, and because of all that happened in the US history, I'm here now. And so it started out as one thing and became something completely different. And of course, it went back to being the thing it was in the beginning, because the reason I'm here and writing is because of the Great Migration. It's because of the Civil Rights Movement. It's because of Reconstruction. It's because our country started from this place of enslavement. And so all of these narratives happen to produce me. And when I was writing Brown Girl Dreaming, when I first started writing it, I wasn't aware of it, and so it became a book about discovery, which was the intention of it, right? To sit down and say, how did I get here? And then figure that out. So I chose Kwame Alexander's The Crossover, and I chose it because it's a brilliant book, and I think it should be read worldwide, and it's a collection of poetry that tells the story of these two brothers and tells the story of basketball and family and all of these very interesting stories. And I think that people sometimes don't think that they have a right to poetry, and that that it's relevant to them, and that it can talk about ordinary things and extraordinary things at the same time, and The Crossover does that.